In the summer of 1995, Amish sisters Iva and Elspeth Vaught hitched their horse to the family's delivery wagon and vanished from their secluded California valley. For 9 years, the accepted story was that they had simply run away, seduced by the forbidden freedoms of the modern world. But in 2004, when state environmental workers were inspecting abandoned mine shafts in the remote foothills, they found something that silenced the whispers forever. Wedged deep in the earth, far below the surface, was the sisters' delivery wagon. The discovery was proof of a violent end, not a quiet escape, shattering the runaway theory. But finding the wagon only deepened the mystery, leaving behind a far more chilling question. If this is where their journey ended, where were the girls? Quilla Vaught was halfway through the painstaking process of oiling the leather harnesses when the quiet rhythm of her day fractured. The scent of neatfoot oil and old leather filled the barn, a smell that invariably conjured the memory of her daughters. Iva and Elspeth had always handled the tack, their laughter echoing against the rafters, their hands quick and sure. It had been 9 years since those echoes faded. 9 years since the girls, 19 and 23, had hitched the horse to the delivery wagon and simply dissolved into the California summer. Methodical and practiced, Quilla worked the oil into a dry martingale. The routine was a balm, a way to keep the stillness at bay. The Vaught farm, nestled in a secluded valley far from the coastal bustle, adhered to the old ways. Life was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the ordnung. But the disappearance had introduced a discordant note that never resolved. The interruption came not as a sound, but a vibration in the earth, a low rumble distinct from the clip-clop of a buggy or the groan of farm equipment. Quilla paused, rag in hand. Walking to the barn door, she looked out across the dusty yard. A county sheriff's vehicle, stark white and jarringly modern, was crawling up the long dirt lane. It was an alien presence here. The English authorities rarely came onto the settlement lands unless summoned, and they hadn't been summoned today. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Wiping her oily hands on her apron, leaving dark streaks on the faded blue fabric, she stepped out into the sunlight to meet the car. A man climbed out, tall and angular, dressed in a rumpled suit that spoke of long hours. He removed his sunglasses, squinting against the glare. "Mrs. Vaught? Quilla Vaught?" She nodded, her throat tight. "I am she." "I'm Detective Vance Russo. I'm with the Major Crimes Unit." He paused, his expression carefully neutral, professional, yet softened by something that looked like reluctance. "We need to talk about your daughters, Iva and Elspeth." The names hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Have you found them?" The question was automatic, a reflex honed over nearly a decade. Russo looked away for a moment toward the foothills that rose sharply in the distance. "Not exactly, ma'am, but we found something significant." He explained that state environmental workers had been conducting mandated inspections of abandoned mine shafts in the remote foothills. A recent scandal involving a leaking chemical cache in an old mine further north had forced a statewide survey of these historical sites. They were looking for contaminants, rusted equipment, anything that might pose an ecological threat. Deep in a narrow shaft, designated only as Site 44B, the survey crew had found something wedged tight, far below the surface. It wasn't mining equipment. "It's a buggy, Mrs. Vaught," Russo said quietly. "A horse-drawn wagon. The description we have on file from 1995. It seems to match." The world seemed to tilt. A buggy, the delivery wagon, the last tangible piece of their lives before the silence. For years, a faction within the community had whispered that the girls had simply run away, that the allure of the English world, the bright lights and forbidden freedoms, had seduced them. Quilla had never believed it. Iva and Elspeth, with their bright blue eyes and steadfast faith, would never have left without a word. But the absence of evidence had allowed the narrative to fester. "I must see it," Quilla said, the words surprising her with their firmness. "It's a difficult location, Mrs. Vout, rough terrain, and the extraction is still in progress." "I must see it," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "If it is theirs, I will know it." The elders would disapprove. Involvement with the outside world, immersion in the violence of the past, it was contrary to the principles of acceptance and forgiveness. But this was not about the community. It was about her children. Untying her apron, she let it fall to the dirt. "Take me there now." The drive was long and jarring. The smooth asphalt of the county roads soon gave way to winding gravel tracks, and finally to rutted dirt paths that seemed barely passable. The air conditioning in the cruiser was a strange, cold sensation against Quilla's skin. They traveled far from the familiar, ordered farmland, climbing steadily into the rugged, isolated mining territory. This was a landscape of scrub oak, dry creek beds, and forgotten history. A desolate place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. Russo was quiet, respectful of her silence. With her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Quilla watched the landscape change. The closer they got, the more the dread solidified into something cold and heavy in her chest. They arrived at the site, a hive of activity that contrasted sharply with the surrounding wilderness. Several official vehicles were parked haphazardly. A large, motorized rigging system had been erected over a gaping hole in the earth. Men in hard hats and reflective vests moved with purpose. Russo guided her through the organized chaos toward the edge of the shaft. The opening was wider than she had imagined, perhaps 15 feet across, the edges crumbling and unstable. "Be careful, ma'am. Stay behind the tape." Ignoring him, Quilla moved right up to the boundary and looked down. The shaft was deep, a cylindrical maw descending into darkness. The sunlight penetrated only the upper portion, illuminating the rough, uneven walls of rock and earth. And then she saw it. It was rising slowly, jerkily, suspended by thick white ropes attached to its undercarriage. The sight was so grotesque, so profoundly wrong, that Quilla felt the breath leave her body. The buggy was unrecognizable at first glance. Skeletal and fragile, it was caked in thick layers of dried mud and grime that obscured its original black color. It looked less like a vehicle and more like the carcass of some strange beast dredged from a primordial swamp. The wooden wheels were weathered and damaged, spokes broken or missing. The black vinyl of the seat was torn and shredded, the backrest tilted at an unnatural angle. It hung suspended in the center of the shaft, rotating slowly in the abyss. The ropes strained under the weight, the winch motor whining in protest. It was a moment that shattered the fragile hope constructed over 9 years. The whispers, the theories, the agonizing possibility that perhaps, somewhere, they were alive. It all collapsed. This was not the aftermath of an escape. This was violence. This was disposal. The buggy cleared the lip of the shaft. The rigging swung it over solid ground. The smell that rose from it was overwhelming. Damp earth, decay, and the cold scent of the subterranean world. It settled onto the ground with a sickening crunch of weathered wood. The forensic team immediately moved in, cameras flashing, but Quilla was already moving toward the wreckage, driven by a visceral need to touch it, to confirm the horrifying reality that stood before her. Detective Russo moved quickly to intercept her. "Mrs. Vout, please. This is an active crime scene. You can't touch anything." "It is my property," Quilla stated, her voice flat but unyielding. Pushing past him, her eyes scanned the mud-caked wreckage. The forensic technicians exchanged uneasy glances, but stepped back, deferring to the detective. Circling the buggy slowly, Quilla absorbed the decay. 9 years of exposure and the weight of the earth had warped and distorted it. Yet the fundamental shape remained. Looking at the seating area, she imagined Iva and Elspeth perched there, their blue and purple dresses vibrant against the black vinyl, their white bonnets crisp in the sunlight. The image was superimposed over the wreckage, a ghostly presence. Certainty was needed. The standard design of the buggies made them nearly indistinguishable to outsiders, but each one bore the unique marks of its owner, the small repairs and modifications made over years of use. Ignoring the damp earth soaking into her dress, she knelt down to peer at the undercarriage, the complex network of springs and braces. The mud was thickest here, hardened like concrete. "I need this cleaned," she said, pointing to the rear axle brace. "Ma'am, we have to process the scene exactly as it is," one of the technicians protested gently. "Russo," Quila said, not looking up. "Clean it." Russo nodded at the technician. "Do it. Carefully. Document everything first." The technician used a fine brush and a spray bottle of water to slowly loosen the hardened mud. The process was agonizingly slow. Quilla remained kneeling, motionless, her gaze fixed on the emerging metal. And then she saw it. It wasn't a manufacturer's mark. It was a weld, a rough, uneven seam of metal where the brace had fractured and been repaired. There. Quilla reached out, her finger hovering just above the weld. "My husband, Ephraim, he did this. The summer before." Her voice faltered. The brace broke when he hit a washout on the lower road. He was not skilled with the welding torch the English use, but he borrowed one. He was proud of the repair, though it was ugly. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, that it could not be mistaken. A detail that had never been included in the original police report, because who would have thought to mention an ugly weld? Russo knelt beside her, examining the mark. He looked at Quilla, his expression grim. "You're sure?" "It is theirs." The confirmation brought no relief, only a profound, crushing weight. The buggy in the mineshaft was a tombstone, even if it held no bodies. Russo stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. He turned to his team. "All right, we have a positive ID. This is officially the Vought cold case. Process everything. I want soil samples from the interior, paint analysis, trace evidence. Tear this thing apart." He spoke quietly with Quilla as the team resumed their work. The initial search of the mineshaft, conducted by the specialized team before the buggy was fully extracted, had yielded nothing else. No human remains, no clothing, no personal items. The buggy was the only thing in the shaft. The agonizing question remained, sharper now than ever. If the buggy was here, where were Iva and Elspeth? The absence of remains felt like a cruel joke, a denial of closure. The drive back to the settlement was heavier than the journey out. The reality of the discovery settled over Quilla like a shroud. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley as they approached the Vought farm. News of the discovery had spread quickly, likely relayed by Russo to the local sheriff, who maintained contact with the community leaders. The quiet lanes of the settlement were unusually active. People stopped their work to watch the cruiser pass, their expressions a mixture of shock, grief, and apprehension. Upon returning home, the dormant sorrow of the past 9 years was violently awakened. The farm felt emptier than before. Ephraim had passed away 3 years prior, his heart broken by the uncertainty. Quilla was alone with the truth. That evening the elders came to her home. Bishop Yoder and 2 deacons sat stiffly in her living room, the room furnished with simple, handcrafted wooden furniture. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Sister Quilla," Bishop Yoder began, his voice grave. "This news, it has troubled the community deeply." "It is the truth," Quilla replied, her hands folded in her lap. "It is a truth that brings pain and disruption," the bishop countered. "For 9 years we have prayed for acceptance. We have sought peace in the will of God. This involvement with the English authorities, this reopening of old wounds, it serves no purpose." Quilla looked at him, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. "My daughters were taken. Their wagon was thrown into the earth like refuse. This is not God's will. This is the work of man. Evil work." "And what will you do, sister?" one of the deacons asked, leaning forward. Will you immerse yourself in the darkness? Will you seek vengeance? That is not our way. I seek answers, Quilla said, her voice rising. I seek to know what happened to my children, and I will not stop until I know. The bishop sighed, a sound heavy with disapproval. We urge you to reconsider. Accept the mystery. Find solace in prayer. Further involvement with the outside world will only bring more sorrow. It will distance you from your faith, from your people. The meeting ended with a strained prayer, the words feeling hollow in the face of Quilla's resolve. The conflict was clear. A chasm had opened between her commitment to the traditions of her faith and the desperate primal need of a mother seeking justice. Isolation defined her now, not just by grief, but by determination. The community sought to absorb the shock, to smooth over the disruption, and return to the familiar rhythms of their lives. But for Quilla, that was impossible. The discovery of the buggy was not an ending. It was a beginning. The silence had been broken, and the echoes from the shaft demanded a response. A few days passed in a strange, suspended state. The discovery of the buggy had indeed brought the unwanted attention the elders feared. Local non-Amish news outlets picked up the story, the sensational angle of the Amish sisters and the abandoned mineshaft proving irresistible. Reporters began to lurk on the edges of the settlement, their cameras and microphones intrusive and disrespectful. Disrupted by the constant presence of outsiders, the quiet rhythm of the community frayed, the tension palpable in the air. Quilla tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, tending to the farm, preparing meals she barely touched, praying for guidance. But the image of the wrecked buggy haunted her waking moments and invaded her dreams. Anxiously, she waited for updates from Detective Russo, but the investigation moved with agonizing slowness. The forensic analysis of the buggy yielded little new information. The years of mud and decay had erased most traces of evidence. The community remained divided. Some offered quiet support, bringing food and condolences, their eyes reflecting their own fear and uncertainty. Others kept their distance, their disapproval evident in their averted gazes and hushed conversations. Increasingly isolated, Quilla felt caught between the world she knew and the dark mystery she was compelled to unravel. Then the fragile peace shattered. It was a Tuesday evening, the air still warm from the day's heat. Zilla Hostetler, a young woman from a neighboring farm, was walking home from a quilting circle. Zilla was 19, the same age Eva had been when she vanished. She was known for her gentle nature and her quick laughter, a bright presence in the community. The path she took was familiar, a narrow dirt road that wound through the dense cornfields separating the farms. The corn was high, creating a tunnel of green that muffled the sounds of the evening. The only light came from the rising moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Zilla was humming softly to herself when the silence was broken by the sound of an engine approaching fast from behind. She moved to the side of the road, assuming it was one of the local farmers returning late. But the vehicle was unfamiliar, a dark, heavy utility vehicle, its headlights blindingly bright. The vehicle pulled up sharply beside her, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. Before Zilla could react, the driver's door flew open, and a man jumped out. He was large, heavy-set, his face obscured by the shadows and the glare of the headlights. He moved with a brutal speed that paralyzed her with fear. Grabbing her arm, his grip like iron, he violently attempted to force her into the vehicle. The attack was sudden and savage. Zilla screamed, the sound swallowed by the dense cornfields. "You think you're so pure?" the man growled, his voice rough and laced with a bitterness that chilled her to the bone. "You're nothing but hypocrites. Get in the truck." The smell hit her then, a strong, pungent odor of yeast and stale beer clinging to his clothes, mixed with the sour scent of sweat. Zilla fought back with a desperate, unexpected ferocity. The terror that had paralyzed her transformed into a surge of adrenaline. Twisting in his grasp, she kicked wildly at his legs. Biting down hard on his hand, the taste of blood filled her mouth. The man roared in pain and surprise, momentarily loosening his grip. Zilla wrenched her arm free and scrambled backward, stumbling on the uneven ground. She didn't look back. Sprinting into the dense cornfields, the sharp leaves slashed at her face and arms. She ran blindly, fueled by terror, the sound of the man shouting angrily behind her, echoing in the night. He pursued her for a few moments, crashing through the cornstalks. But the darkness and the density of the field made the chase difficult. He stopped, cursing violently, then retreated to his vehicle. Zilla heard the engine roar to life, the tires spinning on the gravel as he sped away, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness of the cornfield. She remained hidden for a long time, crouched low to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably, the silence of the night amplifying the pounding of her heart. When she finally emerged from the field, she ran the rest of the way home, the familiar path now transformed into a landscape of terror. She arrived home hysterical, her clothes torn, her arms covered in scratches. Terrified by her appearance and her frantic story, her parents immediately sent for Quilla. Quilla arrived within minutes. The scene in the Hostetler farmhouse was chaotic. Zilla was sobbing uncontrollably, her words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. Kneeling beside her, Quilla felt her own heart pounding with a sickening dread. She gently took Zilla's hands, her calm presence helping to quiet the rising panic in the room. The community was paralyzed. The discovery of the buggy and this new attack suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The threat was not historical, buried in the past. It was immediate, active, and targeted. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into a wave of terror that engulfed the settlement. The sanctuary they had built was no longer safe. The attack on Zilla Hostetler shattered any remaining illusion of safety within the Amish settlement. The following morning, Detective Russo arrived, the atmosphere far more charged than his previous visits. The elders, who had previously urged caution and non-involvement, were now demanding answers and protection. Quilla found herself in a crucial, if uncomfortable, position. Zilla, traumatized and distrustful of outsiders, refused to speak directly to Russo. She clung to Quilla, the shared experience of trauma creating a bond between them. This made Quilla the intermediary, the bridge between the terrified young woman and the determined detective. They sat in the Hostetler's kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the stark simplicity of the room. Gently, Quilla coaxed the details of the attack from Zilla, translating her fragmented sentences and emotional responses into a coherent narrative for Russo. The description of the assailant was vague. He was English, non-Amish. Heavy-set, rough hands, his face obscured by the darkness and the chaotic nature of the struggle. But the most distinct details were not visual, but sensory. "The smell," Zilla whispered, her voice trembling. It was strong, like the mash left over from brewing, sour, yeasty. Quilla felt a chill despite the warmth of the fireplace, the smell of yeast and stale beer. It was a distinct detail, unusual in their community where alcohol consumption was strictly regulated. "What did he say to you, Zilla?" Quilla asked, squeezing her hand. Zilla recounted the words, the phrases laced with bitterness and resentment. "He called me a fraud. He said we thought we were better, safe." She looked at Quilla, her eyes pleading for understanding. "He hated us. He hated who we are." This suggested a familiarity with the Amish lifestyle, a deep-seated animosity that went beyond a random act of violence. It wasn't just an attack, it was a targeted assault on their identity. Russo noted everything, his expression unreadable. He assured the Hostetlers that patrols in the area would be increased, but the isolation of the settlement made constant surveillance impossible. The interview concluded. Russo left, promising to return the next day. The community was left to grapple with the reality that they were being hunted. Walking home late that evening, Quilla found the darkness feeling oppressive, menacing. The familiar path seemed fraught with danger. Every shadow, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She reached her own farm, the house dark and silent. As she approached the front gatepost, something caught her eye that hadn't been there when she left. It was a splash of white against the dark wood, an envelope nailed aggressively to the post with a large, rusted nail. Quilla's heart pounded against her ribs. She scanned the darkness, half expecting the attacker to emerge from the shadows. The yard was empty. Approaching the gatepost cautiously, she saw the envelope was plain, unmarked. The fear urged her to leave it untouched, to summon the authorities, but the need to know was stronger. Carefully, she pulled the envelope from the nail, the paper tearing slightly. Inside the opened envelope was a single sheet of paper, covered in crude, handwritten block letters. The handwriting was erratic, aggressive. The message was short, but the impact was devastating. "Stop searching. They are dead anyway. Leave the past buried or more will follow." Quilla stared at the words, the breath leaving her body. It was a direct threat, a confirmation that the attack on Zilla was connected to the discovery of the buggy. The perpetrator knew who she was. He was watching her, reacting to her involvement. A chilling certainty settled over her. The man who attacked Zilla was the same man who took her daughters. The evil had a shape now, a voice, a smell. She took the letter to Russo the next morning. He examined it carefully, his expression darkening. "He's escalating," Russo said. The discovery of the buggy spooked him. He's trying to regain control. "He says they are dead," Quilla whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It might be an intimidation tactic," Russo cautioned. "A way to make you stop looking. We can't assume it's true." The letter was taken for analysis, fingerprints, DNA, paper analysis. But Quilla knew they would find nothing. The perpetrator had been careful, hiding his tracks for 9 years. The threat galvanized Quilla. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard anger. This man could not be allowed to terrorize her community. He could not dictate the fate of her daughters. The police investigation was moving too slowly, constrained by procedures and the lack of concrete evidence. Quilla realized passivity was no longer an option. She had to find answers herself. She had to understand what happened 9 years ago. And she had to start at the beginning. The threat letter changed everything. It transformed the abstract fear into a tangible danger, but it also ignited a proactive drive in Quilla. Waiting for the police to find a needle in a haystack was unacceptable. If the attacker was watching her, motivated by her search, then she needed to understand the terrain he operated on, both literally and figuratively. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Quilla entered the barn. The scent of hay and leather was familiar, comforting. She hitched her horse, a sturdy Morgan named Bess, to her own buggy. It was smaller than the delivery wagon, lighter, but the rhythmic movements of preparing the tack were the same. Her intention was to retrace the exact delivery route Iva and Elspeth took on that fateful day in July 1995. It was a route she hadn't traveled in its entirety since the disappearance. The memory was too painful, the associations too raw. But now it was necessary. Packing a small lunch and a jug of water, she left a note for the neighbors who were helping with the farm chores, simply stating she would be gone for the day. No one was told where she was going. The elders would disapprove, and the fear in the community was so palpable that any unusual activity would draw unwanted attention. This was a task she had to undertake alone. The buggy wheels crunched on the gravel lane as she left the farm. The morning air was cool, the valley still shrouded in mist. Quilla guided Bess onto the main settlement road, the clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the only sound in the stillness. The delivery route was extensive, winding through the settlement and extending to the neighboring English farms and small towns that relied on the Amish for produce and handcrafted goods. Iva and Elspeth had been making these deliveries for years. They were experienced, capable. The route was safe, or so they had believed. Methodically, Quilla followed the route, visualizing her daughters on the road ahead of her. The first stop was the Miller farm, a few miles down the road. Stopping the buggy at the gate, she looked at the familiar farmhouse. The Millers were still there, older now, their children grown. She didn't go in, just sat there, trying to see what her daughters had seen, to feel what they had felt. She continued on, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The landscape shifted from the ordered fields of the settlement to the more rugged terrain of the surrounding area. The edge of the settlement was reached, the boundary marked by a simple wooden sign. The next stops were the English farms. Visiting the locations, some still active, others abandoned, she spoke to the people who were there, the last confirmed sightings of Iva and Elspeth. She stopped at the Henderson farm, a large ranch that bordered the foothills. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman who had always been fond of the Vaught sisters, met her at the porch. "Quilla, what are you doing out here?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her expression concerned. The news of the recent attack had spread beyond the settlement. "I am retracing their steps," Quilla said simply. "I need to know if there was anything missed, anything unusual that day." Mrs. Henderson sighed, the memory clouding her eyes. "I've told the police everything I know, Quilla. They stopped here around noon. They seemed happy, cheerful. They were talking about the upcoming barn raising. They left, heading toward the general store in town." "Did you see anyone else on the road?" Quilla pressed. "Any unfamiliar vehicles? Strangers?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "It was quiet, just a normal summer day. I watched them go. They waved." She paused, the memory painful. "It was the last time I saw them." Quilla thanked her and continued on. The route led toward the small town of Oakhaven, a few miles away. The general store was still there, under new ownership. The previous owner, Mr. Gable, had retired and moved away. The new owner knew nothing about the disappearance. The trail went cold after the general store. Iva and Elspeth had presumably started the return journey toward the settlement, taking the back road that skirted the edge of the foothills. This was the stretch of road where the abduction likely occurred. Quilla guided Bess onto the back road. It was isolated, narrow, bordered by dense woods on one side and the rising slopes of the foothills on the other. This was the territory that led toward the old mining country, the area where the buggy was found. She scrutinized the route, her eyes scanning the landscape for anything unusual, anything that might explain how a horse and buggy and two young women could disappear without a trace in the middle of the afternoon. The road was deserted. The silence was heavy. Stopping the buggy several times, Quilla got out to examine the surroundings. She looked for signs of a struggle, remnants of the past, but 9 years of weather and neglect had erased any evidence. It was late afternoon when she noticed it, a break in the dense foliage on the side of the road bordering the foothills. It was subtle, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. Stopping the buggy, she got out and pushed through the overgrown brush, the branches scratching at her arms. Behind the screen of foliage was a barely visible track, an old service road, likely used for logging or mining access decades ago. It was overgrown, rutted, but still passable for a vehicle with high clearance. Quilla followed the track for a short distance. It led directly into the foothills, toward the mining territory. This was a potential abduction point. It offered isolation, a place where an attacker could lie in wait, hidden from the main road. And it provided a direct route to the mines, a way to transport the victims and the buggy away from the populated areas without being seen. It was the first tangible piece of the puzzle that fit. It explained the logistics of the disappearance, the absence of witnesses. Returning to the buggy, Quilla's mind raced. The discovery of the service road didn't tell her who the attacker was, but it told her how he operated. He was organized, calculated. He knew the terrain. He had planned the abduction. And if he knew the terrain that well, he was likely local. Someone who knew the back roads, the abandoned mines. Someone who blended in, yet harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Amish. The clues were starting to align: the smell of yeast, the anti-Amish sentiment, the knowledge of the local geography. Quilla realized she needed to look closer at the outsiders who interacted with the community, the people who lived on the fringes, both geographically and culturally. Quilla's discovery of the overgrown service road solidified her hypothesis. The perpetrator was someone familiar with the remote geography of the foothills. Coupled with Zillah Hostetler's testimony, the pungent smell of yeast, and the venomous anti-Amish rhetoric, a specific profile began to emerge. This wasn't a random stranger passing through. This was someone rooted in the area, perhaps ex-Amish themselves, and likely involved in an industry related to brewing or fermentation. The realization forced Quilla to confront a difficult path. The answers were not within the safe confines of the settlement. They were outside, in the English world she had always kept at arm's length. The next day, the journey to Oakhaven, the nearest non-Amish town, began. Guiding her buggy onto the asphalt streets, Quilla felt conspicuous and vulnerable. The noise was jarring: the rumble of engines, the blare of horns, the loud conversations of people rushing past. The modern world felt chaotic, aggressive. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands tight on the reins. Tying Bess to a hitching post near the center of town, a relic of the past that seemed out of place amidst the modern storefronts, she noted the curious glances her Amish attire drew. She ignored them, focusing on her purpose. Her first stop was the general store, the same one Iva and Elspeth had visited on the day they vanished. Although the ownership had changed, it remained a central hub for the local community, a place where gossip and information were exchanged freely. Entering the store, the bell above the door jingled cheerfully. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and spices. She approached the counter, waiting patiently as the clerk, a young woman with bright pink hair, finished ringing up a customer. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, her tone friendly but distracted. "I am looking for information," Quilla began, her voice quiet but firm, "about people who lived in this area around 1995. The clerk looked skeptical. "That's a long time ago. We have records, but—" "I am interested in anyone known to be hostile toward the Amish community," Quilla continued, pressing on, "or anyone who might have been ex-Amish." The clerk's expression shifted. The mention of the Amish community, in light of the recent news, caught her attention. "You're Mrs. Vout, aren't you?" Quilla nodded. "I'm sorry about your daughters, and about what happened to Zillah Hostetler. It's terrible." She paused, thoughtful. "Hostile toward the Amish. That's specific. I don't know anyone like that now, but maybe some of the old-timers." She directed Quilla to the feed market on the edge of town, a place frequented by the local farmers and ranchers who had been in the area for decades. Quilla traveled to the feed market, a large, dusty warehouse filled with sacks of grain and farming equipment. The smell of hay and molasses was familiar, comforting. She found the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, in the back office. He was gruff, suspicious of outsiders, but Quilla's directness and her connection to the recent events persuaded him to talk. "Ex-Amish?" Mr. Abernathy scratched his chin, leaning back in his chair. "Not many of those around here. The settlement keeps to themselves. But hostile, yeah, there was one guy." He paused, searching his memory. "He used to come in here regularly back in the mid-90s. Volatile fellow, always complaining. Had a chip on his shoulder the size of a redwood." "What was he complaining about?" Quilla asked, her heart pounding. "The Amish," Mr. Abernathy said emphatically. "Hated them, said they were hypocrites, frauds, said he had left a community in another state. Good riddance, I say. He was a nasty piece of work." A surge of adrenaline rushed through Quilla. This matched the profile. What did he do for a living? "He was trying to start a brewery," Mr. Abernathy said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A small operation, out in the industrial area near the foothills. Thought he was going to make a fortune. Failed miserably. Went bankrupt a year or two later." A brewery, the smell of yeast, the proximity to the foothills, the timeline matched. "Do you remember his name?" Quilla asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "It was a long time ago. Started with a B, maybe? Baxter? Byler? Something like that. I don't remember. But I remember the smell." "The smell?" "Yeah. He always smelled strongly of yeast, like he bathed in the stuff. Unpleasant." A chill ran through Quilla despite the dusty heat of the warehouse. The clues were converging. A bitter ex-Amish man running a failed brewery near the foothills who smelled strongly of yeast. It was too specific to be a coincidence. Thanking Mr. Abernathy, she returned to her buggy. The name was still missing, but she had a concrete lead, a direction to focus her search. Identifying the failed brewery was the next step. And to do that, she needed access to public records. The realization brought a new wave of apprehension. The county records office was in the county seat, a larger town further away, even more chaotic and unfamiliar than Oak Haven. Navigating the bureaucracy of the English world was a daunting prospect, but Quilla knew she had no choice. The path forward led directly into the heart of the system she had always avoided. The lead from the feed market was the most significant breakthrough since the discovery of the buggy. The failed brewery connected the sensory details provided by Zilla with the geographical location of the disappearance and the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Now a name was needed. The journey to the county seat was a trial in itself. The distance was too great for the buggy. Quilla had to hire a driver, a local man who often provided transport for the Amish community when travel to the English world was unavoidable. The experience was deeply uncomfortable. The speed of the car, the confinement of the cabin, the noise of the traffic, it all grated on her nerves. They arrived at the county records office, an imposing stone building in the center of the bustling town. Stepping out of the car, Quilla felt small and insignificant amidst the towering buildings and the crush of people. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for the task ahead. Inside, the office was a maze of corridors and counters. The air was stale, smelling of dust and old paper. The noise was overwhelming, the ringing of phones, the clicking of keyboards, the murmur of conversations. It was a world away from the quiet stillness of the settlement. Waiting patiently, Quilla approached the main counter. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression, finally looked up. "Yes?" "I need to access public records," Quilla said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Business licenses, permits." "What are you looking for specifically?" the clerk asked, her tone bureaucratic, indifferent. "A brewery, a small operation, located in the industrial area near the foothills. Active around 1995, failed shortly after." The clerk sighed, typing something into her computer. "That's very specific. We have digitized records back to 2000. Anything earlier is in the archives. You'll need to fill out a request form." She handed Quilla a stack of forms, the print small and dense. Quilla stared at the forms, the unfamiliar terminology confusing and intimidating. This kind of bureaucracy was entirely foreign to her. Finding a quiet corner, she began to fill out the forms, her handwriting neat and precise. It took time, the process slow and frustrating. She had to ask the clerk for clarification several times, each interaction reinforcing her sense of alienation. Finally, the forms were submitted. The clerk told her it would take some time to retrieve the records from the archives. Quilla waited, sitting on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. The hours ticked by. The office bustled around her, but she remained still, a silent observer of a world she didn't belong to. Late in the afternoon, the clerk returned with a stack of dusty folders. "These are the records for breweries active in the county between 1994 and 1996. You can look through them at the table over there." Quilla took the folders, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Sitting at the table, she began to sift through the records. Most of them were for larger operations located in different parts of the county. Her focus remained on the permits for the industrial area near the foothills. She found it in the third folder, a business license application filed in 1994 for a small brewery called Bitter Creek Brewing. The location matched the industrial area described by Mr. Abernathy. The records indicated the business went bankrupt in 1996, and the owner's name was listed at the bottom of the application, Kenton Byler. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. Byler, the name Mr. Abernathy had suggested. Quilla stared at the name, the letters blurring slightly. Kenton Byler, the bitter ex-Amish man, the failed brewer, the man who smelled of yeast. She had a name. The abstract evil now had an identity. Her hand trembling slightly, she carefully copied the information onto a piece of paper. The address of the brewery was listed, as well as Byler's home address at the time of the application. She returned the folders to the clerk, thanking her politely. Leaving the records office, the noise and chaos faded behind her as she stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The journey back to Oakhaven was a blur. Quilla's mind was racing, the implications of the discovery overwhelming. Confirmation was needed. She needed to be sure. She went directly to the feed market. Mr. Abernathy was closing up for the day. "Mr. Abernathy," Quilla called out, her voice urgent. The name? Was it Kenton Byler? Mr. Abernathy paused, a sack of grain slung over his shoulder. He looked at her, his expression surprised. Byler? Yeah, that was it. Kenton Byler. How did you find that? The records, Quilla said. The brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. That's the one, Mr. Abernathy confirmed. Nasty fellow. Haven't seen him in years. Heard he moved north after the bankruptcy. The confirmation hit Quilla with the force of a physical blow. It was him. The connection was undeniable. Returning to the settlement as darkness gathered, she held the name. Now she needed to convince Detective Russo. She needed to make him see the connection, the urgency. The realization that the man who took her daughters was still out there, possibly living just a few hours away, brought a new wave of fear, but also a desperate, agonizing hope. If he was alive, perhaps Iva and Elspeth were too. Quilla met Detective Russo the next morning at the edge of the settlement, reluctant to bring him onto the settlement lands and further alienate the elders. They stood by the wooden sign marking the boundary, the morning mist swirling around them. She presented her findings, the information meticulously copied from the county records. The name, Kenton Byler. The brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. The timeline, 1994 to 1996. The confirmation from Mr. Abernathy, the bitter ex-Amish man who smelled of yeast. Russo listened intently, his expression serious as he examined the paper, the details laid out starkly. "This is compelling, Mrs. Vout," he admitted, impressed by her tenacity. "The connection between the brewery, the smell, and the anti-Amish sentiment. It's a strong lead." "He is the man who attacked Zilla," Quilla stated, her voice unwavering. "And he is the man who took my daughters." "We need to verify everything," Russo cautioned, though his tone suggested he believed her. "I'll run a background check on Kenton Byler, see where he is now." He left, taking the information with him. Returning to the farm, Quilla found the waiting agonizing. The hours stretched endlessly. Russo drove back to the station, his mind working through the implications. The Vought case had been cold for 9 years, a frustrating dead end. Now, thanks to the persistence of the victim's mother, they had a suspect, a strong one. He sat at his desk, the organized chaos of the Major Crimes Unit swirling around him, and ran a background check on Kenton Byler. The results came quickly. Byler was still living in California, about 3 hours north in a small town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. His record was peppered with minor offenses, DUIs, disorderly conduct, a few assaults. Nothing that screamed serial killer, but enough to suggest a volatile personality, a man with anger issues and a problem with authority. The profile fit the description of the man who attacked Zilla Hostetler: the aggression, the impulsivity. Russo dug deeper. The background check provided a timeline of Byler's life, his movements across the country. The focus turned to the period before Byler came to California, the time when he left the Amish community. Mr. Abernathy had mentioned Byler left a community in another state. Russo traced Byler's movements back to Pennsylvania, the heart of Amish country. Accessing the national database for unsolved crimes, he searched for incidents involving the Amish community in the area where Byler had lived. He found it almost immediately. A cold case from 1992, the disappearance of a young Amish girl, Sarah Stoltzfus, aged 16. She had vanished while walking home from school. No witnesses, no evidence left behind. The case had never been solved. Russo felt a chill. The similarities to the Vaught case were striking. The victim profile, the circumstances of the disappearance, the lack of evidence. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police, requesting the case file for the Sarah Stoltzfus disappearance. The file was faxed over, the pages curled and faded. Sifting through the reports, the interviews, the theories, he saw the name: Kenton Byler. Byler had been questioned at the time of the disappearance. He had recently left the Amish community, his departure acrimonious and public. He was known for his hostility toward the community, his open resentment of their lifestyle. But there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance. He had an alibi, albeit a weak one, and was dismissed as a suspect. Russo leaned back in his chair, the realization hitting him with full force. They were not dealing with an isolated incident. They were dealing with a serial offender, a man who had been hunting Amish women for over a decade. The Vaught sisters were not his first victims, and the attack on Zilla Hostetler suggested they would not be his last. The urgency of the situation escalated dramatically. Byler was active, dangerous, and likely aware that the investigation was closing in on him. Russo initiated surveillance on Byler's current residence. He needed to know Byler's routine, his movements, his contacts. Evidence linking him directly to the Vaught case was required, something concrete enough for a search warrant. The surveillance team was dispatched to Northern California. Russo waited impatiently for the first reports, the tension mounting. The Vaught case had become a ticking clock, and he feared they were running out of time. The surveillance operation began immediately. A team of undercover officers established a perimeter around Kenton Byler's residence, a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the small Northern California town. The goal was to observe, document, and gather enough evidence to justify a warrant. Russo received the initial reports later that day. Byler was observed behaving erratically. He paced his apartment, peered through the blinds, and made frequent trips to his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Bronco, matching the description of the utility vehicle used in the attack on Zilla. He seemed paranoid, agitated. This was both encouraging and alarming. It suggested Byler was feeling the pressure, perhaps aware that the discovery of the buggy had reignited the investigation. But it also increased the risk that he might bolt, destroy evidence, or worse. Russo decided to oversee the surveillance operation personally. Driving north, he arrived late in the evening and met with the surveillance team, reviewing the logs and the photographs. The next day, Russo took up a position in an unmarked car, watching Byler's apartment. The hours dragged on, the monotony of surveillance punctuated by brief bursts of activity. Byler emerged mid-morning, looking disheveled and agitated. He got into his Bronco and drove out of the apartment complex. Russo and his team followed, maintaining a discreet distance. Byler drove aimlessly for a while, taking back roads, seemingly trying to detect if he was being followed. Finally, he headed toward an isolated industrial area outside of town. Russo recognized the area. It was the site of Byler's former brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. The property was seemingly abandoned, surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusted chain-link fence. The main building, a large warehouse, looked dilapidated, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling. Byler parked his Bronco near the entrance and got out. He looked around nervously before unlocking the gate and entering the property, disappearing inside the warehouse. Russo watched from a distance, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. Why would Byler be visiting an abandoned brewery, a place associated with his failure and bankruptcy? Byler remained inside the warehouse for several hours. Emerging late in the afternoon, he locked the gate behind him and drove back to his apartment. The pattern repeated the next day, and the day after that. Byler made repeated, lengthy visits to the abandoned warehouse. He was seen entering a specific section of the building, a large storage area that should have been condemned. Russo felt a growing certainty that the warehouse was significant. Isolated, secure, and directly linked to Byler's past, it was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. Russo reported back to Quilla, the frustration evident in his voice. He met her at the edge of the settlement, the tension between them palpable. "He's spending hours at the old brewery," Russo explained, leaning against his car. "The warehouse. We think he's using it for something." "Then search it," Quilla urged, her voice tight with impatience. "If he is the man who took my daughters, the answers are in there." "We can't," Russo said, rubbing his temples. "We don't have enough probable cause for a search warrant. The connection to the Vought case is still circumstantial. We have the background match, the suspicious activity, but no direct evidence linking him to the disappearance or the attack on Zilla." "The smell," Quilla insisted. "The brewery, the ex-Amish background. It all fits." "It fits a profile," Russo countered. "But it's not enough for a judge. If we go in without a warrant, any evidence we find will be inadmissible. We have to do this by the book." Quilla was distraught at the delay. The legal constraints of the English world felt like a cruel joke. While the police waited for permission, the man who terrorized her community was free, active. The recent attack on Zilla convinced her that Byler was escalating. She feared he might disappear, taking the truth with him. And the agonizing possibility remained, faint but persistent, that one of her daughters might still be alive, held captive in that warehouse. The image of the dark, dilapidated building haunted her. The thought of Iva or Elspeth trapped inside, suffering for 9 years while the world moved on, was unbearable. The police were paralyzed, constrained by rules and procedures. Quilla realized with a chilling clarity that if she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. The realization was terrifying, but also liberating. Relying on the English authorities was no longer an option. The fight was hers now. The realization that the investigation was stalling, hampered by the very laws meant to protect, crystallized a desperate resolve within Quilla. The police were too constrained, their movements too predictable. If they couldn't act, she would. She had to see Kenton Byler for herself, to see the brewery. Proof was needed, something undeniable that would force Russo's hand. The decision was a profound transgression against the norms of her community, against the teachings of her faith. To actively pursue the man who had wronged her, to immerse herself in the darkness of his world, it was contrary to the principles of acceptance and non-resistance. But the primal drive of a mother seeking her children overshadowed everything else. The logistics were complex. Traveling to Northern California, a journey of several hours, required secrecy. She approached the driver she had hired before, a man named Elias, known for his discretion. "I need you to take me north," she told him, her voice low and urgent. "A few hours away. I will be gone for a few days." Elias looked at her, his expression troubled. He knew the context, the recent events. "Quilla, this is dangerous. The elders?" "I will not ask you to lie for me," Quilla interrupted. "But I must go. Will you take me?" Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will take you." Quilla packed a small bag, her movements methodical, detached. She wore her traditional Amish attire, the dark dress, the white bonnet. It would make her conspicuous, but it was also a shield, a reminder of who she was and why she was doing this. A message was left with her neighbors, a half-truth, stating she was traveling to visit distant relatives who needed assistance. It was a plausible excuse, but she knew it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. The only thing that mattered was finding the truth. The journey north was a blur of asphalt and noise. Quilla sat in the passenger seat, silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The landscape shifted, the flat farmland giving way to the rolling hills of the Sierra Nevada foothills. They arrived in the small town late in the afternoon. Elias dropped her off at a modest motel on the edge of town, a place that catered to travelers passing through. The transaction was awkward, the motel clerk staring at her with undisguised curiosity. Settling into the small, sterile room, Quilla noted the unpleasant smell of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke. The sound of the television from the neighboring room seeped through the thin walls. She felt utterly alone, isolated. She had the address of Byler's apartment complex, provided by Russo during their last meeting. It was a few miles away on the other side of town. As evening fell, Quilla left the motel. She walked, the distance manageable, the exercise calming her nerves. Approaching the apartment complex cautiously, she saw it was a rundown collection of two-story buildings, the paint peeling, the landscaping neglected. Byler's apartment was on the ground floor, the blinds drawn tight. Locating a spot across the street, a small park bench obscured by the shadows of a large oak tree, she sat down, waiting. Staking out Byler was a risky endeavor. Her Amish attire made it difficult to blend in. She had to rely on the darkness and the assumption that no one would pay attention to a woman sitting quietly on a park bench. The hours ticked by. The night was quiet, the stillness punctuated by the occasional sound of a passing car or a distant dog barking. Around midnight, the lights in Byler's apartment went out. Quilla remained, watching, waiting. The next morning she returned to the park bench before sunrise, watching as the apartment complex slowly came to life. People emerged, heading to work, their routines mundane, ordinary. Byler emerged around 8 a.m. Quilla saw him clearly for the first time. He was a large man, heavy-set, his movements aggressive even in the simple act of walking to his car. He wore stained jeans and a dark T-shirt. His hair was unkempt, his face unshaven. He matched the description provided by Zilla. The build, the aggression. He got into his vehicle, the dark blue Bronco. Quilla watched him drive away, the rumble of the engine fading into the distance. Following him on foot, she maintained a discreet distance. He drove to a local diner, a greasy spoon frequented by truckers and locals, and went inside. Quilla waited outside, observing him through the large windows. He sat alone in a booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, seeming agitated and restless. The day was spent observing his routine. He returned to his apartment, then left again in the afternoon, driving toward the industrial area. The distance was too great and the area too isolated for Quilla to follow him there on foot. She returned to the motel in the evening, exhausted but galvanized. She had seen him. His identity was confirmed, and she had observed his obsession with the abandoned brewery. The warehouse was the key. She knew it with a chilling certainty. The answers were inside, and she had to find a way to get in. Quilla shifted her attention from Byler's apartment to the abandoned brewery. Her surveillance confirmed that he spent most of his days there, hidden away in the dilapidated warehouse. The need to see inside, to understand what he was hiding, became an obsession. She decided to scout the property at night. The risk was immense, but the darkness offered a cover she desperately needed. A taxi took her to the industrial area, and she asked the driver to drop her off a mile from the brewery. The rest of the way had to be on foot, the silence of the deserted streets amplifying the pounding of her heart. The brewery was located at the end of a narrow access road, surrounded by other abandoned warehouses and empty lots. The isolation was profound. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Quilla approached the property cautiously. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, topped with barbed wire. The main gate was secured with a heavy padlock. The property was overgrown with weeds, the asphalt cracked and uneven. The warehouse itself was a large, imposing structure. The windows were boarded up or broken, the metal siding rusted and stained. It looked derelict, abandoned. Her heart pounded as she approached the fence. She needed to find a way in. The fence was high, the barbed wire menacing. She circled the property slowly and quietly. Eventually, she found a section of the fence where the ground had eroded, creating a small gap underneath. It was tight, but passable. Hesitation gripped her. The fear urged her to turn back. This was illegal, dangerous. If Byler found her here, there would be no one to help her. But the thought of her daughters, the possibility that they might be inside, propelled her forward. Quilla knelt down and ignored the dirt and grime as she squeezed under the fence. The metal scraped against her back. When she emerged on the other side, her breath was held tight in her chest. She was inside the perimeter. The warehouse loomed ahead. She kept low and used the overgrown weeds and discarded equipment as cover while moving toward it. As she got closer, signs emerged that the brewery was not entirely abandoned. A section of the warehouse, the area where Russo had observed Byler entering, seemed to have power. A faint light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. And the smell. It was stronger here, overwhelming. The pungent odor of yeast and fermentation, the sickly sweet scent of stale beer. But something else was mixed with it, something foul, unpleasant, the smell of decay. Quilla suppressed a wave of nausea, the scent triggering a visceral reaction. She pressed her ear against the cold metal of the warehouse wall. Muffled sounds came from inside. The low hum of machinery running. A faint scraping sound. Something else, indistinct, unrecognizable. She needed to see inside. The wall had few options for viewing. She searched until she found a window that was not boarded up, but it was covered in grime, the glass opaque. Her attempts to wipe the grime away with her sleeve proved useless. It was thick, stubborn. The interior was barely discernible. A large, cluttered space. Shapes indistinct in the dim light. She needed to get closer. The main entrance was a large roll-up door secured with another padlock. She moved toward it. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. Quilla froze. She scanned the darkness. A large shape emerged from the shadows near the entrance. A dog. A large, aggressive-looking Rottweiler. It was chained to a metal stake in the ground, but the lead was long, allowing it a wide range of movement. The dog saw her. It barked viciously, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. It lunged toward her, the chain snapping taut as it reached the end of its tether. The dog was agitated, ferocious. It strained against the chain, its teeth bared, its eyes fixed on her. Quilla stumbled back. A jolt of adrenaline surged through her. She hadn't expected a guard dog. The noise was too loud. If Byler was inside, he would have heard it. Retreat was the only option. She turned and ran back toward the fence. The dog's barking followed her as she scrambled under the fence and disappeared into the darkness. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road. Her lungs burned. Her body trembled. She had failed to get inside the warehouse, but her suspicions were confirmed. Byler was using the brewery. He was hiding something there, and he was protecting it. The setback was frustrating, but it also clarified the challenge. Getting into the brewery undetected was impossible. The security measures were too tight. A new strategy was needed. She needed to rattle Byler, force him to make a mistake. Direct confrontation was the only path left. The decision was terrifying, reckless. But Quilla knew it was the only way. The passive observation had reached its limit. It was time for action. The encounter with the guard dog crystallized the reality of the situation. The brewery was a fortress, and Kenton Byler was guarding its secrets fiercely. Quilla realized that a stealthy approach was impossible. The police were still immobilized by legal constraints. Time was running out. A highly risky strategy was formulated. She couldn't get into the brewery, but she could get to Byler. The goal was to rattle him, to force him out of the shadows and into the light. Confirming his identity publicly, exposing him, might force him to make a mistake in his panic. From her surveillance, Quilla knew Byler's routine. He frequented the local diner, the Greasy Spoon on the edge of town, every morning at 8 a.m. sharp. It was a public space, neutral ground, offering a degree of protection, but also the potential for a volatile confrontation. The next morning, Quilla arrived at the diner before sunrise. Sitting in a booth near the entrance, her back to the wall, she had a clear view of the entire room. She ordered a cup of coffee, the bitter liquid scalding her throat. The diner was quiet, the early morning clientele sparse. A few truckers, a couple of locals reading the newspaper. The waitress eyed her with curiosity, but didn't ask any questions. Quilla waited, her hands clasped tightly around the warm mug. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The words she would say, the questions she would ask, were rehearsed in her mind. At 8 a.m., the bell above the door jingled. Kenton Byler walked in. He moved with the same aggressive energy she had observed before. He looked disheveled, agitated. Scanning the room, his eyes narrowed before he settled into his usual booth in the back corner. Quilla watched him, her gaze steady. The waitress approached him, the interaction brief, familiar. Byler ordered his coffee. This was the moment. Standing up, Quilla's movements were deliberate, measured. Walking toward Byler's booth, the eyes of the other patrons followed her. The silence in the diner seemed to deepen, the tension palpable. She reached the booth. Byler looked up, his expression annoyed, expectant. He didn't recognize her at first. He saw an Amish woman out of place, perhaps seeking charity or assistance. "Kenton Byler," Quilla said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. Byler froze, the coffee mug halfway to his lips. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough. "My name is Quilla Vaut." The recognition hit him instantly. He must have seen her picture in the local news coverage of the buggy discovery. Or perhaps he had been watching the settlement, studying his victims. "You!" he hissed, the word laced with venom. "I want to know what happened to my daughters," Quilla continued, her voice unwavering. "I want to know about the abandoned mine shaft." Byler's expression darkened, a storm of rage gathering in his eyes. "You have no right to be here. You have no right to ask me anything." "And the smell of yeast," Quilla pressed on, the words calculated to provoke a reaction. "The smell on the day Zilla Hostetler was attacked, the same smell that clings to you now." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The other patrons in the diner were staring now, the conversations hushed. Byler's reaction was explosive. He slammed the coffee mug onto the table, the liquid sloshing over the rim. Standing up, he towered over Quilla. "You crazy bitch!" he roared, his face contorted in rage. "You think you can come here and accuse me? You think you can dredge up the past?" He lunged forward, flipping the table with a violent heave. The dishes shattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Quilla stumbled back, the violence of the reaction shocking her, despite her anticipation. Byler was enraged, exposed. He advanced on her, his hands clenched into fists. "I should kill you right now," he threatened, his voice loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. The diner owner emerged from the kitchen, alarmed. "Hey, what the hell is going on here? Get out! I'm calling the police." Byler paused, the threat of the police momentarily cutting through his rage. He looked around, realizing he was exposed, vulnerable. He glared at Quilla, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't over." He stormed out of the diner, slamming the door behind him, the bell jingling frantically. Quilla stood amidst the wreckage, her body trembling, but her resolve hardened. The goal had been achieved. Byler was panicked, exposed. He had confirmed his identity, his volatility, his connection to the events that had shattered her life. But she had also placed herself in immediate, critical danger. Byler knew she was in the area. He knew she was hunting him, and he had just threatened her life in front of witnesses. Quickly leaving the diner, the eyes of the patrons followed her as she stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. She didn't look back. The confrontation was far from over. The chase had just begun. Quilla burst through the diner doors, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding her. She didn't look back, knowing Byler was right behind her. The roar of his rage echoed, followed by the sound of the diner door slamming open again. Running blindly, she was fueled by a surge of adrenaline. The quiet morning streets of the small town were suddenly transformed into a landscape of terror. Byler stormed out of the diner moments after her and immediately pursued her. He was faster than she expected, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "You can't run!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the deserted streets. "You ruined everything." Quilla was at a severe disadvantage. No vehicle, no knowledge of the area, no cell phone. Her Amish attire made her conspicuous, a target impossible to miss. Ducking into a narrow alleyway, the sudden darkness offered a momentary reprieve. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Byler skidded to a halt at the entrance of the alley, his eyes scanning the darkness. He hesitated, unsure if she had gone through or hidden. Quilla seized the opportunity. Scrambling over a low wooden fence at the back of the alley, she emerged into a small courtyard. Running across it and through an open gate, she emerged onto another street. Blending in, disappearing into the crowd, was essential. Ahead, a busy outdoor market appeared, the stalls crowded with shoppers. She ran toward it, the sound of Byler's footsteps echoing behind her. Plunging into the crowd, she weaved through the narrow aisles, the vibrant colors and sounds of the market swirling around her. The anonymity of the crowd offered a fragile shield. Byler crashed into the market moments later, his aggressive movements disrupting the flow of the shoppers. He scanned the crowd desperately, his eyes wild with rage. Quilla kept moving, staying low, using the stalls and the shoppers as cover. She saw him looking in her direction, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. Ducking behind a large display of fruits and vegetables, her heart pounded in her chest. He moved closer, his presence suffocating. The familiar odor of yeast and sweat cut through the fragrant aromas of the market. He was just a few feet away. Holding her breath, she prayed he wouldn't see her. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the other end of the market. A stall had collapsed, sending a cascade of oranges rolling across the ground. Byler turned toward the sound, distracted. Quilla didn't hesitate. Slipping away from the stall, she merged back into the crowd, moving quickly toward the exit of the market. Emerging onto the street, the sound of the market faded behind her. Looking back, she expected to see Byler emerging from the crowd, but he was gone. She had lost him, for the moment. Getting away from the area was crucial, finding a place to hide, regroup, and plan her next move. Across the street, a public transit bus approached a stop. She ran toward it, lungs burning, legs heavy with exhaustion, reaching the stop just as the bus pulled up. The doors hissed open. Scrambling onto the bus, she fumbled with the change in her pocket. As she moved toward the back of the bus, she saw him. Byler had emerged from the market and spotted her. He ran toward the bus, his face contorted in a mask of rage. The bus driver, oblivious to the drama unfolding, closed the doors. Byler reached the bus just as it began to pull away. He banged furiously on the windows, his shouts muffled by the glass. Quilla watched him from the window, her body trembling with relief and terror. He stood in the street, watching the bus disappear down the road, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he vanished from sight. She was safe. For the moment. Getting off the bus in a different part of town, she found a quiet residential area far from the center. The streets were lined with trees, the houses small and neat. She found a public library, the building modern and imposing. Inside, the cool, quiet atmosphere was a welcome respite from the chaos of the chase. In a secluded corner, she sat down, the silence enveloping her. She was safe, but the victory was temporary. Byler knew she was in the area, he was actively hunting her, and he was enraged, unpredictable. The confrontation had forced him out into the open, but it had also backed him into a corner. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous. Quilla knew she had to act quickly. The chase had created a window of opportunity. Byler was distracted, focused on finding her. He wouldn't be at the brewery. This was her chance, her only chance to get inside the warehouse. The adrenaline from the chase slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Quilla knew Byler would be searching the town for her, his rage blinding him to everything else. He would be distracted and preoccupied. This was the window of opportunity she had created, a brief moment where the brewery would be unguarded. It couldn't be wasted. Evening fell, and the darkness offered a degree of cover. Quilla left the library. The quiet streets felt ominous, menacing. She had to make her way back to the isolated industrial area, a journey of several miles without being detected. The back roads and alleys provided cover. The shadows concealed her movements. She traveled slowly and cautiously, her senses heightened. Every passing car, every distant sound sent a jolt of fear through her. The guard dog remained a problem. The ferocious Rottweiler was a formidable obstacle, and another confrontation was too risky. She stopped at a small grocery store. The bright lights were jarring against the darkness. She purchased a package of raw meat, the thick steaks heavy in her hand. Her next stop was a pharmacy. The sterile environment smelled of alcohol and medicine. She bought a bottle of mild sedative, a sleep aid recommended by the pharmacist. The plan was risky, uncertain, but it was the only option she had. Late in the evening, she reached the industrial area. The silence was heavy, oppressive. The abandoned buildings loomed like skeletal remains against the night sky. The brewery property lay ahead. Quilla approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The fence was still there, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. At the familiar spot, she squeezed under the fence. The metal scraped against her skin. Once on the other side, the smell of yeast and decay washed over her. She kept low and moved toward the warehouse, her eyes scanning the darkness. The guard dog was there, chained near the main entrance. It was asleep, curled up in a tight ball. Quilla approached the dog slowly. Her movements were deliberate, quiet. In her hand, she held the meat, the sedative sprinkled generously over the surface. The dog stirred and lifted its head. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Quilla stopped. She held out the meat. "Shh," she whispered, her voice soothing. "It's okay." The dog hesitated, suspicious, but the smell of the raw meat was enticing. It stood up and took a tentative step toward her. She tossed the meat toward the dog. It landed on the ground a few feet away. The dog looked at the meat, then at Quilla. Hunger won over suspicion. It lunged at the meat and devoured it in a few gulps. Quilla waited, her breath held tight in her chest. The sedative would take some time to work. The dog remained alert for a few minutes, pacing restlessly. Then its movements started to slow, becoming sluggish. Finally, it lay down. Its head rested on its paws, its eyes closing. The dog was neutralized. Now she needed to find a way inside. The back of the warehouse seemed more promising than the main entrance with its roll-up door. A small, grimy window caught her attention. The glass was broken in one corner. It was high up on the wall, but accessible. She searched for something to stand on. A discarded wooden pallet leaned against the wall. She dragged it toward the window, the sound loud in the silence. The pallet was unsteady beneath her feet as she climbed onto it. She reached the window. The rest of the glass had to be broken. Another search of the area yielded a tire iron, rusted and discarded in the weeds. She used the tire iron to smash the window. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the stillness. Working quickly, she cleared the remaining shards from the frame, creating an opening large enough to climb through. The metal frame dug into her hands as she pulled herself up. She scrambled through the opening and dropped onto the floor inside the warehouse. The landing was hard, jarring her body. She lay there for a moment, listening, her senses overwhelmed by the darkness and the smell. She was inside. The air was thick, heavy. The smell of stale beer and decay intensified, almost suffocating. The darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the broken window. Quilla stood up. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. She was in a large, cluttered space. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the dripping of water somewhere in the distance. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the determination was stronger. She had come too far to turn back now. She started into the darkness, navigating the cluttered space, heading toward the area where the lights had been seen, the area where Byler spent his time, the area where the secrets were hidden. Quilla navigated the darkness of the warehouse, her movements slow and cautious. The interior was a cavernous space, the ceiling high above her, the shadows stretching long and distorted in the pale moonlight. The air was thick and heavy, the smell of yeast and decay so strong it coated her tongue with a bitter taste. But beneath it, the foul odor she had noticed before was more pronounced, a distinctly human smell of sweat, filth, and something else, something sickly sweet and unsettling. Moving through a maze of old brewing equipment, towering metal vats, rusted pipes, stacks of wooden pallets, she found the floor slick with spilled liquids, the footing treacherous. The silence was broken by the low hum of refrigeration units, suggesting that parts of the brewery were still operational. She headed toward the area where the lights had been visible, the section of the warehouse that Byler frequented. In the back corner she found it, a makeshift living space carved out of the clutter. It was a disturbing sight. A filthy mattress lay on the floor, surrounded by discarded food containers and empty beer bottles. A small, portable television flickered silently in the corner, the screen casting an eerie glow over the scene. The walls were covered in strange writings and symbols, scrawled in black marker. Quilla stared at them, her blood running cold. It was a twisted ideology, a mixture of religious condemnation, misogynistic rants, and strange ritualistic phrases. This was a glimpse into the darkness of Byler's mind, his hatred and resentment laid bare. A wave of nausea washed over Quilla. This was the environment where Byler nurtured his hatred, where he plotted his revenge against the world he believed had wronged him. Searching the living space, she looked for any sign of her daughters, any evidence linking Byler to the disappearance. Nothing was found. No clothing, no personal items, nothing to suggest that Iva or Elspeth had ever been there. The frustration mounted. The warehouse was vast, the clutter overwhelming. If there was something here, it was well hidden. Expanding her search, she moved deeper into the warehouse, into the areas that seemed abandoned, unused. She found herself in a section that looked like a storage area, filled with stacks of old grain sacks and discarded equipment. The air was colder here, the smell of decay stronger. It was then that she noticed it, hidden behind a large stack of grain sacks, almost invisible in the gloom. A heavy metal door. It looked like an old cold storage room, the kind used for storing perishable goods. But the door was reinforced, the metal thick and solid, and it was secured with a large new padlock, the metal gleaming in the dim light. A cold storage room, reinforced and padlocked, in an abandoned brewery. Quilla approached the door, her heart pounding, the suspicion solidified into a chilling certainty. This was what Byler was hiding. Pressing her ear against the cold metal, she listened. The silence was heavy. Nothing was heard at first. Then a faint sound, a slight shifting movement, a suppressed breath. Someone was inside. Quilla's breath caught in her throat. The agonizing hope, the desperate fear, collided in a wave of emotion. Eva! Elspeth! She had to get inside. The padlock was thick, solid. Breaking it with her bare hands was impossible. Frantically searching the area, she looked for tools. The darkness hampered her search, the clutter obscuring everything. A toolbox was discovered hidden under a workbench, the metal rusted and stained. Inside the open box, a collection of tools, disorganized and dirty. She found a heavy bolt cutter. The blades were dull, the handles stiff, but it was the only option she had. Returning to the door, the bolt cutter heavy in her hands, she positioned the blades around the shank of the padlock, the metal cold against her skin. Squeezing the handles, she put all her strength into the effort. The metal groaned, resisting. The padlock held firm. She tried again, a surge of adrenaline giving her renewed strength. Squeezing harder, the muscles in her arms burned. The metal snapped, the sound loud in the silence. The padlock fell to the ground, the clang echoing in the stillness. The door was unlocked. Quilla hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The fear of what she might find inside was overwhelming. The possibility of disappointment, the confirmation of her worst fears. But the need to know was stronger. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for what was to come. She turned the handle and pulled the door open. A wave of cold air washed over her, the smell of filth and despair overwhelming. The darkness inside the room was absolute. Stepping inside, Quilla's eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. "Iva?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Elspeth?" No response. Reaching for a light switch on the wall, she flipped it on. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a dim, yellowish light over the scene. The sight that greeted her was so horrific, so profoundly wrong, that Quilla felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The room was small, windowless, a concrete cell. The conditions were horrific. The floor was covered in filth, the walls stained and peeling. A thin, dirty mattress lay in the corner, the only furniture in the room. The air was cold, the smell of human waste and despair suffocating. In the center of the room, huddled on the floor, was a woman. Pale and thin, her skin was almost translucent. Dressed in ragged non-Amish clothing, a stained t-shirt and sweatpants hung loose on her emaciated frame. Her hair was long, tangled, dirty. She was rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes closed. Reciting something in a low, monotonous voice, the strange, ritualistic phrases were recognizable from the writings on the warehouse walls. Quilla stared at her, her heart breaking. The woman was broken, traumatized, lost. And then the woman opened her eyes. They were blue, a bright, piercing blue, the same blue as Elspeth's, the same blue as Iva's. The recognition hit Quilla with the force of a physical blow. It was Iva, her younger daughter, 19 when she vanished, now 28. "Iva," Quilla whispered, the name a prayer, a plea. Iva looked at her, her eyes wide with fear, yet devoid of recognition. Scrambling back, she pressed herself against the wall, her body trembling. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. "He will be angry. I am not allowed to speak." She was terrified of Quilla, terrified of punishment from Byler. The 9 years of captivity had erased her identity, her memory, her connection to the world. Quilla approached her slowly, her movements gentle, soothing. Kneeling down, her hands were outstretched. "Iva, it's me. It's Mama." Iva shook her head, the movement frantic, desperate. "Number I am anathema. I am nothing." The words were Byler's, the twisted ideology he had forced upon her. Fighting back the tears, Quilla felt the grief overwhelm her. Her daughter had been found, but she was lost. She had to reach her. Breaking through the wall of trauma and indoctrination was essential. She started speaking to Iva in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of their community, the language of their home. The words felt strange, foreign in this horrific place, but they were the only connection she had to the past. "Iva, my sweet girl, do you remember the farm, the horses? Bess?" Iva hesitated, her rocking slowing down. The familiar sounds of the language seemed to penetrate the fog of her trauma. Quilla started humming a lullaby, a simple tune she used to sing to her daughters when they were children. The melody hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. Iva looked at her, her expression shifting. A flicker of recognition sparked in her eyes, followed by a flood of suppressed emotion. "Mama?" The word was barely a whisper, a question filled with disbelief and fear. "Yes, Iva, it's me. I found you." Quilla reached out, gently touching her daughter's face. Iva flinched at the contact, then leaned into her mother's hand, a sob escaping her lips. The dam of her trauma broke, the years of suppressed pain and fear pouring out in a torrent of tears. Quilla wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tight, rocking her gently. Iva clung to her, her body racked with sobs. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the warehouse broken only by the sound of Iva's weeping. Finally, Iva's sobs subsided. Pulling back, she looked at Quilla, her eyes red and swollen. "He said you were dead," she whispered. "He said everyone was dead." "I am here, Iva. I never stopped looking for you." A shadow crossed Iva's face. "Elspeth, where is Elspeth?" Quilla's heart broke again. The question she had dreaded, the truth she had feared. Iva saw the answer in her mother's eyes. "No," she whispered, the denial automatic, desperate. "Iva, what happened?" Quilla asked gently, steeling herself for the answer. Iva's voice was fractured, hesitant, the words tumbling out in a torrent of horrific memories. She recounted the abduction, the sudden attack on the isolated road, the man in the dark vehicle, the struggle. Elspeth had fought back, aggressively, fiercely. She had tried to protect Iva. Byler had been enraged by her defiance. He had hit her, hard, too hard. Elspeth had fallen, hitting her head on the sharp edge of the buggy. She never woke up. Byler had panicked. He had brought them both to the brewery. Elspeth was already dead. He had disposed of her body. Iva didn't know where, and he had kept Eva, locked her in the cold storage room, for 9 years. The abuse, the isolation, the indoctrination, the forced conversion to his twisted beliefs, the rituals, the punishments. The horrific truth was laid bare, the darkness overwhelming. Quilla held Iva tight, the grief for Elspeth mixing with the overwhelming relief of finding Iva alive. "We have to go," Quilla said, her voice urgent. "We have to get out of here before he comes back." She tried to lead Iva out of the cell, but Iva was weak, her legs trembling. Paralyzed by fear, the thought of leaving the cell, the only world she had known for 9 years, was terrifying. "He will find us," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He always finds us." "I won't let him hurt you any more, Iva. I promise." Quilla pulled Iva to her feet, supporting her weight. They moved toward the door, the darkness of the warehouse looming before them. Escape was imperative, before Byler returned, before the window of opportunity closed. Suddenly the warehouse was flooded with light. Headlights flashed across the interior, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the roar of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. Byler had returned. Quilla's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The slam of the car door echoed through the cavernous space as he exited the vehicle. Heavy footsteps approached the warehouse entrance. Quilla quickly pulled Iva out of the cell, extinguishing the light. Plunging back into the darkness of the warehouse, they scrambled for cover. Hiding among the towering metal brewing vats, the shadows offered a fragile shield. Quilla held Iva close, her daughter's body trembling uncontrollably. Byler entered the warehouse. He paused, scanning the darkness. He must have sensed something was wrong. The silence, the stillness. Moving toward his living space, his footsteps were loud in the emptiness. Quilla held her breath, her arm wrapped tightly around Iva. A sudden roar of rage echoed through the warehouse. Byler had found the open cell door, the cut padlock. "No!" he screamed, the sound guttural, animalistic. The sound of destruction followed. Byler was tearing apart his living space, his rage explosive, uncontrollable. Then the footsteps started moving again. Heavy, deliberate. He was searching for them. "He's coming," Iva whispered, her voice paralyzed with terror. Quilla looked around desperately for a way out. The broken window was too far away. They would never make it without being seen. Hiding was the only option. Pulling Iva deeper into the maze of brewing vats, the towering metal structures offered a degree of cover. They crouched in the shadows, the darkness enveloping them. Byler stalked through the warehouse, searching for them, his movements aggressive, unpredictable. He was ranting, his voice a low monotone, the twisted phrases of his ideology mixing with threats of violence. "You can't leave," he shouted into the darkness. "You belong to me. You are nothing." He grabbed a heavy piece of metal piping from the floor, wielding it like a club. He smashed it against the metal vats, the sound deafening. He was getting closer. Quilla could see him now, a dark silhouette against the dim light filtering through the entrance. He was moving systematically, checking behind every piece of equipment, every stack of pallets. He reached the area where they were hiding. Pausing, his head tilted, listening. He saw them. A guttural sound escaped his throat. He lunged toward them, the metal pipe raised high. Quilla pushed Iva behind her, shielding her with her own body. Byler swung the pipe, the metal whistling through the air. Quilla ducked, the pipe smashing against the vat behind her, the impact vibrating through the metal. A desperate physical struggle ensued. Quilla fought with a primal intensity, the adrenaline surging through her veins. No match for Byler's strength, she used the environment to her advantage. Kicking a bucket of cleaning chemicals toward him, the liquid spilled onto the floor, creating a slippery surface. Byler slipped, stumbling backward, his movements clumsy, uncertain. Quilla pulled down a stack of unstable equipment, the metal crashing onto the floor, creating a barrier between them. Byler roared in frustration, his rage escalating. He lunged at her again, his face contorted in a mask of hatred. Quilla saw the opportunity. A large, unstable fermentation vat towered over them, its metal frame rusted and corroded. It was a gamble, a desperate act of defiance. As Byler lunged at them, Quilla shoved the vat with all her strength. The metal groaned, resisting. Pushing harder, the muscles in her arms burned. The vat started to tilt, the movement slow at first, then accelerating. Byler looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He tried to scramble back, but it was too late. The vat toppled over, crashing onto him with a deafening roar. The heavy metal pinned him to the ground, the impact shaking the entire warehouse. Byler screamed, the sound cut short by the crushing weight. He was trapped, incapacitated. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Quilla stared at the wreckage, the realization of what she had done sinking in. Grabbing Iva's hand, she urged, "Come on, we have to go, now." They fled the warehouse, running through the darkness, the sound of Byler's muffled groans fading behind them. They didn't look back. They ran into the night, toward the distant lights of the town, toward freedom. They ran until their legs gave out, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. Reaching a nearby road, the asphalt was rough beneath their feet. The night was quiet, the stillness a stark contrast to the violence they had left behind. Iva was stumbling, her weakness overwhelming her. Quilla supported her weight, her arm wrapped tightly around her daughter's waist. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. A large truck, the engine rumbling in the silence. Stepping onto the road, Quilla waved her arms frantically. The truck slowed down, the air brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, leaned out of the window. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "We need help," Quilla said, her voice hoarse. "We need a phone. We need the police." The driver saw the state they were in, the ragged clothing, the filth, the fear in their eyes. His expression shifted from weariness to alarm. Climbing down from the cab, he pulled a cell phone from his pocket. "What happened?" "A man held us captive," Quilla explained, the words feeling surreal, inadequate. "In the abandoned brewery, down the road." Using the driver's phone, she called Detective Russo. The phone rang several times before he answered, his voice gruff, sleepy. "Russo." "It's Quilla Vout. I found her. I found Eva." A stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What? Where are you?" Quilla gave him the location, the details tumbling out in a torrent of fragmented sentences. The brewery, Byler, the cell, the fight. "He's trapped," she finished, her voice trembling. "Under a vat. He's injured, but alive." "Stay where you are," Russo ordered, his voice sharp, alert now. "I'm sending units to your location and to the brewery. Don't move." The wait was agonizing. Quilla held Iva tight, the reality of their escape slowly sinking in. They were safe. They were free. The police arrived moments later, the flashing lights painting the darkness in shades of red and blue. The paramedics followed, their movements efficient, professional. Iva was gently loaded onto a stretcher, her body limp with exhaustion. Quilla stayed by her side, holding her hand as they were transported to the local hospital. Sunrise found them in a sterile hospital room. Iva was admitted for severe malnutrition, dehydration, and comprehensive physical and psychological evaluation. She was asleep, the deep, restful sleep of the truly exhausted. Sitting by her bedside, Quilla watched her daughter sleep. Iva looked fragile, broken, the years of captivity etched on her face. But she was alive. She was safe. The emotional weight of the reunion was immense. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tinged with a profound sadness. The truth about Elspeth, the confirmation of her death, hit Quilla with full force. One daughter found, but the other lost forever. Finally, she allowed herself to grieve for Elspeth. The tears came silently, tracing paths through the grime on her face. The pain of the loss was sharp, visceral, but it was also a release, a confirmation of the truth she had denied herself for 9 years. Detective Russo arrived later that morning, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it, Mrs. Vout," he said quietly. "You saved her." "She saved herself," Quilla corrected, her voice tired but firm. Russo updated her on the situation. Byler had been extracted from the wreckage and taken into custody. Severely injured, but he would survive to face justice. The brewery was now an active crime scene. The investigation had just begun. Quilla listened, the details feeling distant, unimportant. The only thing that mattered was Iva. The fight wasn't over. The escape was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, arduous. Iva was deeply traumatized, the psychological scars running deeper than the physical ones. The process of healing, of deprogramming the years of abuse and indoctrination, would be a monumental challenge. A new purpose became clear to Quilla. 9 years had been spent searching for her daughters. Now the rest of her life would be dedicated to helping Iva heal, helping her reconnect with the world she was forced to leave behind, helping her find her way back to herself. She looked at Iva, sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the window, illuminating her face. A faint smile touched her lips. The darkness had been overwhelming, but it had not extinguished the light. The hope remained, fragile but persistent. The journey had just begun. The scene at the brewery was organized chaos. Police tactical teams swarmed the warehouse, the flashing lights reflecting off the metal siding. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and decay, the atmosphere heavy with the darkness of what had occurred within these walls. Russo oversaw the operation, the satisfaction of the arrest overshadowed by the horrific reality of Iva Vaught's captivity. Kenton Byler, severely injured but conscious, had been extracted from beneath the fermentation vat. He was belligerent, uncooperative, his rants filled with the same twisted ideology found on the warehouse walls. He was transported to the hospital under heavy guard. The search of the warehouse began immediately. The forensic team, clad in protective suits, moved through the cluttered space, documenting everything. The cell where Iva had been held captive was the primary focus. The horrific conditions, the filth, the despair. It was a testament to the depth of Byler's depravity. The search expanded to the rest of the warehouse. In Byler's makeshift living quarters, evidence confirming his obsession with the Amish community was found, his hatred and resentment laid bare in his writings and belongings. And then they found the items that confirmed the horrific truth of Elspeth Vaught's fate. Hidden in a locked metal box, buried beneath a pile of discarded equipment, a small collection of personal items was discovered. A silver locket, tarnished with age, a hand-carved wooden bird, a faded blue ribbon. Quilla identified them later that day. They had belonged to Elspeth. The discovery confirmed Iva's fragmented account of the abduction. Elspeth had been murdered, her body disposed of. The search for her remains began, the vast wilderness surrounding the brewery presenting a daunting challenge. The investigation widened. The evidence found in the warehouse, the writings, the specific items, also linked Byler definitively to the disappearance and murder of Sarah Stoltzfus in Pennsylvania. The scope of his crimes spanned over a decade, his targeted hatred and psychological manipulation more extensive than they had imagined. Kenton Byler was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and long-term abuse. The case was airtight, the evidence overwhelming. Justice would be served. The news of the arrest and the confirmation of Elspeth's death spread quickly through the settlement. The reaction was a mixture of relief, grief, and shame. Quilla returned briefly to her community, leaving Iva in the care of the hospital staff. A proper memorial service for Elspeth was needed to acknowledge her death, to honor her memory. The service was held in the community cemetery, a simple plot of land overlooking the valley. The entire community attended, the silence heavy with shared grief. Bishop Yoder approached Quilla after the service, his expression humbled, remorseful. "Sister Quilla," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we were wrong. We urged acceptance when action was needed. We prioritized peace over justice. We failed you." The realization that their previous judgment and reluctance to act had allowed the evil to fester was a bitter pill to swallow. Quilla looked at him, her gaze steady. "I did what I had to do." The community embraced her, offering support and solidarity. The isolation she had felt, the conflict between her faith and her determination, dissolved in the face of the shared tragedy. They pledged to support her and Eva in the long journey of healing that lay ahead. Returning to the hospital, Quilla's heart was heavy with grief, but also filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The past was buried, the truth revealed. The future was uncertain, but it was a future she would face together with Eva. Months later, the seasons shifted, the vibrant colors of autumn fading into the muted tones of winter. Iva was transferred to a specialized long-term trauma care facility, a quiet retreat nestled in the hills far from the darkness of the brewery. The healing process was slow, arduous. The years of abuse and indoctrination had left deep scars, both physical and psychological. Iva was withdrawn, barely verbal, her days filled with therapy sessions and quiet reflection. The process of deprogramming the rituals and beliefs forced upon her by Byler was a monumental challenge. She struggled to reconcile the twisted ideology that had governed her life for 9 years with the reality of the world she was slowly reconnecting with. Quilla remained steadfastly by her side. Moving into a small apartment near the facility, her life revolved around Iva's recovery. A constant presence, she was a source of comfort and stability in the turbulent sea of Iva's trauma. She bridged the gap between the life Iva had lost and the future she now faced. Familiar items from the farm were brought: a quilt made by Elspeth, a wooden bowl carved by her father, the scent of lavender and beeswax. Speaking to Iva in Pennsylvania Dutch, the familiar language was a balm to her wounded soul. Reading to her, singing to her, the simple acts of love and connection slowly broke through the walls of her trauma. The progress was measured in small victories: a shared smile, a spontaneous memory, a moment of connection. The trial of Kenton Byler took place during this time. Quilla attended every day, her presence a silent testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Byler was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure, a confirmation that justice had been served. But it didn't erase the pain, the loss, the years of suffering. The healing continued. One afternoon, Quilla brought a quilting frame to the facility. Setting it up in the common room, the colorful fabrics were a vibrant splash of color in the sterile environment. Sitting down at the frame, her movements were methodical, practiced. She started quilting, the needle weaving through the fabric, creating intricate patterns. Iva watched her, her expression curious. Approaching the frame, her hand reached out to touch the fabric. "Do you remember?" Quilla asked gently. "We used to quilt together, you and Elspeth." Iva nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Quilla handed her a needle and thread. "Would you like to try?" Iva hesitated, then took the needle, her hand trembling slightly. She sat down beside Quilla, the quilting frame between them. Focusing on the fabric, the needle poised above the surface, she took a deep breath. Then she pushed the needle through the fabric, completing a single stitch. It was a small, imperfect stitch, but it was a beginning. Quilla looked at her daughter, her heart filled with a profound love and a fragile hope. The road ahead was long, the healing incomplete. But they were together, and they were moving forward, one stitch at a time.